Okay, so this is just part of my introduction that I kind of did. Born in Buffalo. Here's the place I got my first stamp album, which was the H.E. Harris Liberty album. This is the catalog and the advertisement for the little store that I worked in the early 70s, where I was paid $1 an hour. This is part of an illustration why they had the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo. What they did is they put Buffalo in the middle here, and here's Niagara Falls, but they drew a circle around it, and what they realized is that they could get almost 50% of the population of the whole United States to Buffalo with a one-day's train ride. And so this is Quebec, here's Montreal, here's the eastern seaboard, Maine and New York City, Boston and Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Then you come over here to Cincinnati and Chicago. And that's a large buffalo with a restaurant on top and searchlights coming out.
Oh, that's awesome.
And that never happened, but I wish it had. That would have been the coolest thing for them to do. It didn't happen, but this is what happened. This is the entranceway to the Pan Am. These are the four welcoming pillars. This is the electric tower, but you could go up here in an elevator. This is called the electric tower, and this was the focal point. You could see this for almost a half an hour away from Buffalo, and this is what it looked like at night when they turned those lights on. The Temple of Music is where President McKinley attended. The Ethnology Building is another. Here's the 6 commemoratives that the post office made. Well, when the inverts came out, and there were only inverts of the 3. They did have some quality control, so the 5 and 8 and 10s didn't come out upside down. So here's 7 of the stamps that the gentleman distributed for the Pan Am, and these are part of the ones that he did, over 4 million. And this is the U.S. stamp from 2006 with Cinderella on it that doesn't have anything to do with that term. Here's the examples of Cinderellas on covers. The World's Fair of 1933 is shown on that one. Here's a patriotic one, Fly with the U.S. Marines, on this cover. And here's that one we talked about with Franklin Roosevelt. This came out 2 years after he had died, but stamp collecting, and he was so interested in that hobby. So here's what I accumulated since I was a kid, and I had to figure out what to do and how do I sort these, etc. And so I started out by sorting them in colors. Then I sorted them into, there's 20 different buildings, or 19 plus Niagara Falls, and I arranged them that way. Or here's some of the building stamps close up, and I wound up talking to that fellow at the Houston Stamp Show, Jonathan, and he's the one that encouraged me to do this project. And I thought, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to recreate the life story of 2 fellas that weren't famous, born in the 1870s? But I was directed here to the American Philatelic Society, which is our national stamp club. And I went there in 2012, and I told them about my project, and by the time I arrived, a couple weeks later, they had 53 books sitting on a table for Mr. Barrett to start going through. And at the time, there were 27,000 items in their library. They now have a new library there with over 40,000 items. I would start going through these different books from the late 1880s into the early 1900s, looking for information on either of these 2 fellas. So I was going through these, and I found a lot of fun stuff that wasn't related to my book, including the smallest philatelist in the world, and these are a few examples of other things I found. This guy was coming to America to judge a stamp exhibit, and it certainly looks like he's got some credentials to do something. And never disturb a stamp collector. He might be a genius at work. There was a lot of opinionated. It was more opinionated than today. These editors would comment on another editor's stamp journal and say, this article was good, but the rest of it isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And they would just insult each other and stuff. So here's the beginning of my first quest to figure out, how do I do a numbering system? And if I ask that question a number of times and get the same answer from a variety of people, I felt you have to follow up. This is just the beginning when I would start putting numbers to these Hale stamps. And so they said, okay, go to the Collectors Club of New York. So this is where I went. It's been around since 1896. They welcomed me. This is their book room, and they let me check things out. And this is the basement of the Collectors Club of New York. And the reason that I'm showing you these pictures is because this is the very first time that I found a picture of William B. Hale, and there he is. There's only 2 in existence that we know of, and this is one from an advertisement that he put out in the mid-1890s, and he used a variety of times. So what happened next? I said, I'm coming to where he lived. So I came to Hubbardston, and I wound up meeting the friends of Jane and others here, Paul Sweeney, and I said, I've got to get the local take on things. Here's his dad. There's the sepia-colored picture. Postmaster, American Express agent, Seth P.H. Hale was his name. He had a good name. So the Hale name and the Bennett name were really well known, and they were, held in regard here. In Houston, it would be the Hoffeints. There's Hoffeints Pavilion. There's the Hogg family. Here, it was the Bennetts and the Hales, and you see, different references to Hale on street signs and things. I'm sure you know many more than I do, but this was his dad, and that came out of here, 1899 Hubbardston, Mass. History book. And so I started learning about William. Here's the first ad that I could find from him, December 1886, and W.B. Hale, coins wanted in exchange for U.S. and foreign stamps. So that's when I first came to understand what he was into. This was his first stamp journal, and this came from the Smithsonian. They have 4 of these, and they're only 4 pages, the size of a business card. But this was his first thing. The thing that I find interesting about Hale's stamp journals that he wrote about 4 different of them, and I'll show you some more examples. But he always talks about forgeries or the genuineness of things. Here he says, the popular stamp dealer, all stamps are in fine condition, genuine. The second one is called the Collector's World. You can remember he's only 16 years old at this time, but when I read these and his writing got better. He was an educated person, and he had a personality about him that you can sense that grew. His next thing was called Curiosity World. This is from 1888 when he was 17. So make money, boys, profit in stamp dealing, and he'll send you stamps if you send him, he'll send you the particulars. So here's some examples of covers. These are actually called, we call them return address, right? In the stamp collecting world, they're called corner cards. Different corner cards of William B. Hale. This is likely his handwriting. This is the earliest one that I've ever found. So here's the Stamp Collector's World, Williamsville, #1. So he was the editor of this thing. This was, again, when he was only 17 years old. Here you go, William B. Hale. Manuscript of merit is always welcome, meaning please write an article so I can fill up my magazine. Here's another envelope or corner card. This is when he was 18 years old. He was wholesale and retail. He not only sold publications but supplies, and this one is from 1891 when he'd have been 20 years old. Here's Williamsville again. And then we go to 1894. Why these stamps are upside down, I'm not quite sure, because usually when stamps are upside down, it means that the sender is in love with the person that's receiving them. But here we go. This is 1895, and I know this is his handwriting. This is also a famous or a well-known stamp dealer, and he's saying that he's interested in Confederate stamps and wholesale, and retail, export. And around this time, he wound up sliding down his mail order business. And the thing that I found is that it was because his eyesight was going bad. What occurred when he did less mail order, though he still had the Williamsville, Mass address his entire life, he wound up doing more traveling. But he was also doing more shenanigans. He was, there were several things in stamp collecting papers that were like, you gotta, and they didn't mention it by name, but there's like someone in the country town of central Massachusetts who's not selling, the right thing, and blah, blah, blah. We're not going to accuse anybody by name, but you might know who he is. And it was William, and he was forging stamps, and he was also applying cancellations at times when he shouldn't. Here's a letter that he wrote to that stamp dealer, and in here, I haven't heard from you a while, and he says, I haven't heard from you. Well, look at this line, I can have no crooked work. Yours truly, William B. Hale. And this is the only autograph that I have of Mr. Hale, but I shall have no crooked work. So here's a business address directory that was circulated to collectors and other dealers, and he was known as the traveling stamp merchant. He wound up not only initially going down the eastern seaboard to share his wares and talk at stamp clubs and things like that, but he would then go to the Midwest and go to different clubs and speak. Eventually he went all across the country to San Francisco and then into Mexico. He did some business in Canada. He loved Newfoundland for some reason. There's a lot of forgeries that he's associated with in Newfoundland, and I'm talking over maybe a 5-year period or so that he was doing this. So here's a map, and here's the store, the Seth P.H. Hale store. You may recognize some of this being close by. And then up the hill here, if you go left, is where he lived, and across the street is where his dad lived. In fact, it's on a hill, an incline, and there's a red pickup in front of there. In fact, there's the house. There's the house that's there. Okay, more examples of William doing advertising. And he said, from Maine to Mexico, just another, watch out for me. Well, you better watch out for William. The stamp drummer. A drummer was the term for a traveling salesperson. And so he was coined as the stamp drummer. That's what people, and he had a good following. I mean, he went out to San Francisco. Here's San Francisco in the mid-1890s, and he wound up enjoying his time out there and making friends with a guy named Wilhelm Schellschap. He's a German fellow that had a great reputation, moved from Germany to San Francisco, and he put it in philatelic facts and fallacies. He wrote great stuff he couldn't spell. This is supposed to be PH, but it sounds good. And I was so glad to find the November 1894 issue because it had the second picture ever known of William B. Hale. This is he and how he looked in the mid-1890s. This one, William, his stories were incredible. He was hit by a team of horses while riding a bicycle and wound up having to recover. When he went to Mexico after San Francisco, he was on a train that was held up by bandits and wrote that the only reason he survived was because of the rabbit's foot in his pocket. They also were on this train and it went up a hill and it couldn't make it down, and so couldn't make it up, so it slid down and they had to try about 4 or 5 times. It finally made it, and so William wound up writing about these or telling people about his antics in various articles that I was able to uncover in the late 1890s. So this was a postcard that he had, and he would send it out to people. I expect to be in your place on such and such about, this place and at this hotel, so come bring me your stamps or I'll sell you some fake ones or whatever. And that was his marketing tool. This is his passport application from 1900, and it tells a little bit more about him. You know, passport photos did not come into play until 1918, and so before that you basically had to get a description. So he was 29, and here's his height, 5'10", and a high forehead, and different color eye, and straight nose, and things like this. These characteristics were detailed in this fashion, and this is what he went on. The SS Saxonia, he wound up going with an interpreter who happened to be a stamp dealer from Worcester. And so that was really good because he got somebody that could speak the language, both the stamp collecting language and the other languages. And he wound up going overseas for almost 18 months. And first stop was England. The article that was prior to this that showed his picture tells of how, between the time they left and the time they arrived, every night they were at the piano singing songs and all this stuff. And William was a character and carrying on and partying. After he arrived in England, they went to France. And this is going to turn into his stamps that were printed with his name on it. He wound up in Paris, and this is what's called the Paris Bourse, another way of saying the Paris flea market for stamps. And every weekend there would be people setting up tables or chairs of stamps and people going around to buy them. Now this, you had to watch your pocket because there were pickpockets there were a lot of forgeries. William loved this place. And here's some examples. He says about it, he loves it. And this is still going on today, actually. It's near the Champs-Élysées in Paris, but now it's almost all postcards. It's postcards and buttons, and not many stamps, but there's not as many stamp collectors either. Here's a detail of a lot of his travels called Stamp Collector Fortnightly and Philatelist on the Rialto, and he tells about the Paris Bourse and how great it was there, and this is where he met that fella who printed the stamps. Alfred Baguette was that printer's name in Paris, and these are some of the Paris Exposition ones, but Alfred Baguette printed these, and he's the one that got Williams stamped printed. Here's the Niagara Falls one, and this is one of the 43 combinations. Here's the Bridge and Whirlpool, and as you can see, William B. Hale, stamp merchant, Williamsville, Mass., USA. If you go on eBay, you can find the 4 without his name or without his full name. Some of them have William B. Hale and Williamsville, Mass. They don't have stamp merchant there, but those are on eBay all the time for $3. These are basically some of the dealer stamps, a dealer lot and what I passed around and helped me number them. His travels of 18 months were documented in this 12-page thing called William B. Hale Abroad. If I scroll in, look at all the places he went. Austria, Malta, Andorra, all these places. And he met the Pope. He got to meet the Pope. You don't just go to the Vatican and say, hey, I want to meet the Pope. You've got to have an invitation and some connection, and he knew someone else, and he got to meet Pope Leo XIII. He gave out these books or sold them, I don't know which, but Hale's Universal Pocket Book. Stamp collectors have little books that they put, those black pages that I passed around, they're called stock book pages. He had little bitty, it's about this size, you might say, an address book, and he had his name on it, and then here's the inside. William B. Hale, philatelic publisher from Williamsville, Mass. When he got back from his trip, he wound up, here's another crazy thing, William, dumb luck, he went and lived here. This is the Park Avenue Hotel in New York City, very opulent, beautiful place, and yet he was there when 17 people died in a giant hotel fire there, and he almost died. This was front page news, not just in New York, but all across the country. One of the resources I used was newspaper.com, and I've got newspapers from Cincinnati with this on the front cover, and Des Moines and things like that. So it was a big deal, and it listed who was hurt, who died, and William B. Hale, or W.B. Hale, was listed as, here we are, robberies were committed while the fire was in progress. It says the most serious loss reported yet. Oh, robberies occurred while people were trying to get out, and it says the most serious loss was from William B. Hale, and he said he lost jewelry and stamps worth $5,000. William wound up putting himself on 2 stamps. There he is. These are his stamps, and these are Cinderella stamps. They're big. They're really rare. I only have 2 brown ones, 3 of these in my life. I love that he puts the pyramids on here of Egypt. He puts a palm tree, and he puts his autograph on here, William B. Hale, 1 peso. I don't know what that means, the Swiss Alps. But so 1906, we get up to this stamp journal in Germany, and what happened was William B. Hale is listed in German. William B. Hale, Williamsville, Mass. Well, what happened was one German customer was frustrated that he received fake stamps from William, and he wrote to a famous stamp dealer in Boston named J.M. Bartels, and J.M. Bartels had a great reputation. He's in the Philatelic Hall of Fame especially, but anyway, this German collector wrote to him and said, I've been ripped off, what do I do? Bartels talked to Hale. I don't think that there was ever any affinity at all between Bartels and Hale himself. They probably knew who each other was, but Hale probably steered aside from him. But anyway, Bartels said, I've spoken to him, and Hale will provide full restitution to those who request it. And so anyway, what this means is that Hale's philatelic career was pretty much done by January of 1906. This ad was probably placed around January of 06. This is the last ad I've ever seen of him that relates to stamps in the collecting world or as a stamp dealer. So what did he do after that? Well, he became a postcard salesman, a postcard publisher. This is just a different smattering, and there's a notebook over there with about 140 different ones. You may recognize some of these places. Some of them are just the creek at the bend in the road or something, or a tree at the bend in the creek and things like that. But, all the different small towns, Hubbardston, Williamsville, Barry, Athol, Gardner, Orange, whatever, Templeton, and a few from Vermont. And so what happened between about that was around 1906, those postcards, till, I don't know how long he did. I've never figured it out, but 1910, 12, what did he do in the next 10 years? That's a mystery. I don't know. This is 1922, and our friend, the printer in Paris, Alfred Baguette, he was arrested in Paris for forging stamps and sent to jail. So William was buying tons of stamps from wherever he could, hopefully 50-cent, $1, $2, $5, so that he could wash the cancellations off of them, and he could then sell them for half price to people as brand new postage. He was doing ads as Spot Cash Williams because he couldn't use his name. He couldn't use William B. Hale or he'd be called out in the mid-20s, and they caught up with him. Here we go. This is 1926. What this is the post office is sending back a ledger that he kept of all his business, which really is how they got him. In the Worcester House of Corrections. Yeah, and he was there for a year and a day, and he didn't learn his lesson. So he now calls himself an agent, a publisher, an importer, an exporter. He's got bank references here. He kind of switches from Williamsville to Hubbardston, maybe because of the dead post office issue. And so fraternally yours, Hale. And so this is what he was doing after he got out of jail the first time. Mr. Hale wound up living here in the Charleston Hotel, beautiful place, and he had 2 rooms, 2 suites actually, one to live in and one that he would wash stamps out of. In fact, here, March 3rd, 1929, the Charleston Hotel, room 221 is where he was doing business, and he's got his autograph here, signature, and he says the Charleston Hotel. Now, the guy that had been on his tail for the post office was this man, a postal inspector, William Kenyon. He had been in the postal service for 40 years, and he wrote this book in 1960. He wrote a book in 1960. He wound up writing about William B. Hale. Now, this guy had been involved in the capture of criminals. When he first started as a postal inspector of a region, this was before the FBI and things like that, when there was a bank robbery or a shootout or something, the local sheriff would call the postal inspectors, and they would come in, and usually by the time they got there, everybody was gone and whatever, but there was some amazing things earlier in the book. The arrest was actually front page news, not just in Charleston. This is from the Greenville, South Carolina newspaper. Stamp washer believed caught. Arrest in Charleston thought to have uncovered a ring. And he did. He had like these 8 people, these agents that were sending in stuff every single day. These huge boxes. He would clean them. He would send them to Hubbardston, and where he re-gummed them. And then he would sell them after he put new gum on the back of them. So this was all across the country. This wasn't just in South Carolina. Alleged stamp washer is held. He was bound over. They froze his bank accounts so that he couldn't make bail. As I said, he made $3,000 a day from sometime in 1928 until he was arrested in 29. Over $1 million in that year. And he couldn't get out of jail during the time he pled not guilty. So it's alleged William B. Hale held for trial, and I wound up in this basement again at the Collectors Club in New York, and I found file here, famous stamp crook. And they had some things, and I also saw 35 letters that he hand wrote from jail to his attorney. Not in this library, but a different library. And every one of these letters, it plays such a victim, saying, oh, my health is bad, and you got to get me out, and all this stuff. I really didn't do anything wrong. And he even wrote on this one, my birthday's tomorrow, 1 year older, and in jail. Hey. So he was, not too happy to be there. He was in ill health too. In fact, when he was in that Worcester jail, part of the last months of that, the House of Corrections moved him to the hospital in Worcester. Anyway, here's his confession, and he confessed to a very small thing that, I washed a few stamps, and they, whatever, but they had the ledger. So they said, look, Inspector, this guy and another guy, they had him. And so he was sentenced to 20 months. in the penitentiary in Atlanta, the federal penitentiary. And let's see, okay, so this gets us up to July of 1930. He's been in jail for 13 months here, and they finally grant him parole. So he lived 6 more weeks when he got out. He got out, he went to Boston around the 10th or so of September. He wound up in hospital there, and he died on the 18th of September, 1930. What I end my story with is that there's been a mystery that's been perpetuated for 80 years in the stamp collecting community. Some guy from Worcester, famous and fairly well-off person named Frank Coes, C-O-E-S. I plan on doing a lot more research on just him because he was very active in the stamp world for a couple decades, a treasurer and a secretary of clubs and things like that, so it'll be easy to find information. But he must have had a falling out with Hale at some point. I don't know where, I don't know how. He never says anything good about him. This is part of the mystery that I just wound up catching on to. And this guy, Frank Coes, put out something in 1936, December, and these are some Hale hand stamps. This guy, Coes, goes on to say in this article that was perpetuated in 14 different other places until 2014, that William died in 1935 in the penitentiary in Atlanta, federal penitentiary, and when he died, which was 5 years wrong, and it says that he died, this is one of the perpetuating places, and he said that he died with cancellation things, indices in his jail cell. Here's another one, the Newfoundland Newsletter. Hale was a traveling stamp salesman with considerable questionable ethics who peddled bogus items. He was also jailed at one point and died in federal penitentiary in 36. That's wrong. When Hale died, a number of forged hand stamps were found, including one for this stamp. And I kept reading this over and over, and I'm like, you can't be in jail with a bunch of hand stamps. What are they going to do? You can't have a box of hand stamps in jail and be faking stuff. And so I'm like, what's going on? And so, here's another one. What does this guy say? When the late Mr. William B. Hale passed away during his sojourn in the federal custody of Atlanta, the public executor found in his possession a quantity of hand stamps and cancellation blocks. These were destroyed by the executor, who was supposedly Coes, in this federal employee's presence. That's not true. I wound up contacting the Department of Justice to try and get some jail records to find out, are there records, are there parole records, are there stuff that would say he had this stuff in his cell or something? And they said, you have to file a Freedom of Information Act request. And I'm like, what? And it was easy. This is the card that they found, and here it shows that he was paroled. He was paroled on August 10th, and this full term. And William B. Hale. Here's the other side. He was eligible December 29, but the lawyer messed up. Prior record deferred until next meeting. They had a meeting to try and parole him, but they screwed up. Anyway, so he died September 18th, 1930, Massachusetts General Hospital, of heart disease. And so this is one example that's in the public record that contradicts Coes. I found this was the Masons. He was a Freemason. This confirms the same date of death, 9/18/30. He did his 3 different exercises to be admitted into the Masons. What's funny here is occupation musician. I sensed that if he said stamp dealer, that they wouldn't have admitted him because they would have seen his nasty past. So he said he was a musician.
What's the date of that, 14?
Well, the date of death.
That's the date of death, but when did he kind of...
Oh, he became a Mason in February 9th of 1898.
He was in there, he served 30 or 40 years.
Right, exactly. And so I also got a death certificate from the Massachusetts, and forgive me if I'm not saying the department correctly, but the Department of Statistics and things like that. And You know, again, for $30, I got his actual death certificate. And then there's one here that's from Hubbardston, the standard certificate of death. And this one was the one from Hubbardston, residence Main Street here. This one came from Hubbardston. Age was 59 years, 3 months, 4 days. There was nobody with any money, so the undertaker just put him in the plot. So I find it ironic that he's buried at Hale Road Extension and Williamsville Road. But that's where he is. He's somewhere in that cemetery down the street here, you know, a couple miles away. And there's the family stone, but there's no confirmation of which actual plot he's in.